Welcome to the Brain Over Binge podcast, where you learn a simple, brain-based approach to ending binge eating. I'm Kathryn Hansen, author of Brain Over Binge and the Brain Over Binge Recovery Guide. The goal of this podcast is to help you stop harmful behaviors with food by giving you practical ideas, information, and insights that you can apply in your own life. To support you, I've created a free 31-day inspiration booklet, which gives you daily reminders to stay focused and motivated in recovery. You can download it at brainoverbinge.com/inspiration-booklet, and you can find that link in the show description. On today's show, I'm joined by Ted Ryce, who is a health expert and a coach to entrepreneurs, executives, and high-performing and successful professionals who want to reclaim their health, their productivity, and who want to live a legendary life. And Ted is the host of the Legendary Life podcast. He has worked with Fortune 500 CEOs and celebrities. But what many people don't know about Ted is that his path to becoming a high-performance coach involved unimaginable tragedy. And now he shares his own journey of resilience to help others deal with the stresses and hardships in their own lives. And that's what we'll focus on in this episode, how to take care of yourself during stressful times, whether that stress is due to very difficult things happening to you, or whether that stress is because you're striving to be successful in your career or personal life. We'll also address how making time to focus on health without going to any extremes can really help you during those high-stress times or those high-pressure seasons of achievement. As Ted talks about in the show, he does not work specifically with binge eaters or anyone with an eating disorder in general, but there is a lot of overlap between the world of binge eating recovery and the broader health, food, and fitness fields. And even people without an eating disorder who are trying to pursue a healthier life can sometimes struggle with episodes of overeating or what feels like out of control eating. It's always helpful to hear from people with different backgrounds, focuses, and life experiences because we can all learn from each other. During the conversation, Ted does share some very general suggestions for eating and exercise in a way that honors everyone's individual differences. So use what seems applicable for you and keep working on creating your own unique path to healing and to better health. Ted also touches a bit on supplements, which I think is a very helpful conversation to have, but with any of this, always be sure to check with a medical professional when implementing changes to your routine. The last thing I'll say before sharing the conversation with Ted is that I was a guest on his Legendary Life podcast recently, and I've included a link to that episode in the show description if you want to listen. Hi, Ted. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Kathryn, great to connect again. Happy to come on your show.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to have a great conversation today. We're really going to talk about two different areas. One, how to stay connected with taking care of yourself when you're a high achiever or when you're super busy out accomplishing things in the world, and also how to take care of yourself during times that may be very emotionally challenging or when you're dealing with some form of tragedy in your life. So this is something that Ted has a lot of experience with personally and professionally. So Ted, why don't you just start by introducing yourself and how you came to teach people about these things?
Yeah, so a lot of people know me from being a personal trainer to people like Robert Downey Jr. before his first Iron Man movie and Ricky Martin. When I was living back in Miami Beach, also worked with Richard Branson and his wife, mostly his wife, but met Richard once. But a lot of people don't know the story about how I got into health and fitness because most people assume that I was always into health and fitness, which there is some truth to that. But but I was in high school, I was a total, I was smoking weed, skateboarding, getting into a lot of trouble. So not the football player, quarterback type that a lot of people assume when they meet me. And anyway, the journey started, well, I got into neuroscience in college. I didn't do well in high school, but as soon as I got into college and got to choose the courses, what I, wanted to study was more about the brain behavior, how drugs affected the brain too. Well, I ended up dropping out. My younger brother was kidnapped and murdered. I don't know how much we want to go into that story. It's a really horrible story, really, like really bad. And I'm not just, yeah, it hurts people when they hear it. So if you want, you can Google Jimmy Rice if you're interested in learning more. But it became big news in Miami. But for me, my parents were off doing great things and helping missing children, but I was kind of left on my own. And I ended up finding my way into health and fitness around 22 years old. I started as a personal trainer in Miami Beach after not really knowing what to do with my life. And the reason why I got so passionate about it was at 19, when that all happened with my brother, I was in a situation where the narrative became for my life like, oh, life is over. Everything I thought about the world was wrong. And, it's just, I didn't know my life just fell apart. I fell apart emotionally, financially, physically too. And what I learned was even though, despite the circumstances I was dealing with, I ended up going to the gym and doing exercise, mostly lifting weights, and I started feeling better. And something kind of clicked for me. It was like I thought I was going to feel bad for the rest of my life. And lifting weights and exercise and focusing on other aspects of health became like my path to heal from what I went through. And after that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is something that could help anyone and everyone. And I ended up learning a ton of stuff afterward, but that's how it all started.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a powerful story, right? You've been through some of the hardest things anyone could ever go through. And the fact that taking care of yourself, exercising, led you through that in a way is super powerful. And I think when people have been through such hard things, it's easy to just give up and kind of neglect yourself and think, oh, what does it even matter? You have those thoughts that say, oh, you should just give up. And you didn't listen to those thoughts. You just kind of kept going day after day. So maybe we could start there and just dive into a little more of the mindset shifts that help you and that help your clients, kind of keep going through tragedy or when everything else seems to be falling apart.
Yeah, and it's a great conversation. I can preface it by saying this because some people hear my story. I'm like, oh no, I'm like, someone got murdered. Like, I don't even, I watch documentaries about that on Netflix or podcast episodes about but like it actually happening. But when it comes down to it, PTSD in any form, it's just extreme stress, right? And either a chronic sense or intensity. And so everyone deals with stress. And so if you're alive, you're dealing with stress and depending on where you are and what your expectations are, what your perspective is, right? I've worked with clients who got really stressed because a yacht they bought did not fit on their waterfront, like outside on the dock on the waterfront house that they had in Miami Beach. Got super stressed. Now he was ripped off. Don't need to go into the story, but the point is, like we all suffer with stress. It comes in different forms and depending on our life, our lifestyle. And so we're not taught in school about stress, about how it affects us, about like your work is about how the brain, right, is a big driver in some of our behaviors. And so I feel like people don't understand stress isn't just how I feel, or you can't just say, oh, I just need to tough this out, right? Well, you can do that, of course, but what I found is understanding, what you're going through and how to cope with it effectively so that you come out the other side and maybe even in a better way, right? That's how I kind of frame it for people.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And what I teach people is yes, during times of stress, your brain may prompt you to act in certain ways. I talked about on your show, the brain has these motivations to survive, to seek pleasure, and to avoid pain. And sometimes when there's stress, your brain either goes into that survival mode to kind of want to shut down, or it can cause you to want to seek pleasure in ways that are not helpful, right? A lot of people that I work with, when they have stress, their brain has this conditioned link to seek pleasure in food. So you end up with this stress urge binge type pattern that gets reinforced over time so that every time the stress comes up you get the urge. But that doesn't mean that doing those harmful behaviors like binging or another behavior that the brain perceives as pleasurable, that doesn't mean it actually helps with the stress. And most of the time, it makes things worse. And I'm wondering if that also speaks to your experience and experience of your clients as far as like they may get into some patterns of doing harmful things in times of stress that actually don't help them. And then kind of how do you help them get out of those patterns?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying this. When we're talking about stress, we're talking about your autonomic nervous system. There's a few different branches of your nervous system, and I'll keep the physiology lesson super short and to the point, but just to make it outside of your perception or your narrative about what stress is, this is what it is, right? And so you have two different sides to this particular nervous system, which are your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. Sympathetic, you already know what it is, even if you've never heard that term. It's fight or flight, right? It's when someone cuts you off on the highway and nearly causes an accident, your heart starts pumping, and you're full of adrenaline, you're a little shaky. That's the fight or flight response. So anytime you've ever felt that, and it can come on in a variety of different ways and in a variety of different circumstances, or if you've ever given a public talk, right, and your palms get a little sweaty and your heart's kind of pumping, it's the same thing. That part of our brain, or nervous system rather, not our brain, but our nervous system doesn't really sort of assess so it doesn't know if like, are you being chased by a predator, or are you struggling because your business is going through a rough spot because of some changes in Google Ads or something? You know what I mean? So it doesn't differentiate on that. And so we can put so many things can put you in a fight or flight, and fight or flight isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's how long it you take to return to baseline. And so the other side of that is your parasympathetic. So we know this is important. I'll tell you why, because things like alcohol raise cortisol. They activate your sympathetic. So if you're like, oh man, I'm so stressed, man, this guy today, oh God, I need to pour a glass of wine so I can relax. You're not really relaxing. You may enjoy the experience when alcohol affects the neurochemistry in your brain, but it's not relaxing. Because if you track your heart rate, which I do, and you don't need to do this, but the point is your heart rate starts speeding up when you drink. That's not relaxation. That's the opposite, right? Coffee does that. Exercise does that. Lifting weights does that. Running does that. So getting really angry does that, right? So it's a stress. So you want to start to understand like, oh, when I do certain things, it activates stress in a predictable way. Another thing that causes stress is shifting time zones. Like I love going to Europe, but traveling through time zones and 6 hour time difference from Miami to, let's say, Lisbon, Portugal, one of my favorite places to go, is it's stressful to your body. Whether you perceive it to be or not, it's going to cause physiological changes. And I think that's the point. And so what we need to do is kind of understand like, okay, well, this is what's going on. These certain behaviors or certain circumstances activate the sympathetic side, the fight or flight side. And so we never really have a conversation about like what calms us down, right? So time in nature, time with friends. If you've ever spent a night having great conversations and interacting with people, and maybe you didn't even sleep that well, but you woke up the next day feeling like, you know what? Last night was so amazing. That's an example of like things that trigger the parasympathetic side. Or if you feel like, oh man, I'm really like sometimes I just get stressed like everyone else. I'll go and get a massage, I'll do a float tank, and then afterwards there's a noticeable, perceptible drop in my anxiety levels or stress levels. So how do we put that in action? Well, first we have to understand change starts with awareness. So now you have some awareness about what's going on and how stress isn't just a feeling, it's physiological. And how I put that into play with clients, I had a client call today where we implemented a few things. So we implemented alcohol free. So I never like to restrict people's choices because I think it causes the forbidden fruit effect for a lot of people, right? It's like, oh, I can't have that thing, which makes me want it even more. So
Yeah.
what we do, but we do things like, it's like, hey, you're going through a stressful period. You need to do things like sleep well, we need to do things that put you back to baseline, that get you back to baseline. So let's get rid of the habits that are causing an increase in stress. So we got rid of alcohol. We put her on coffee every other day or caffeine every other day, right? And we started also, I think this is important. Lifting weights is awesome, and it's really the foundation of what will allow you to keep your bone density, what will allow you to keep your muscles as you get older. It's like, in my view, it's the number one thing you should do and start with. That said, if I have a client going through a stressful period, I try to implement more cardiovascular exercise. Another thing that causes stress, unfortunately, getting older and how it causes stress specifically, because I'm not just talking about, oh, so much more responsibility. I'm talking about physiological changes. So aerobic exercise is the number one thing that helps get you back to a good place. So even if you have the most wonderful life, your sympathetic, the sympathetic side of that nervous system, the tone, if you will, it starts to increase over time. And does that have anything to do with like the stereotype of grumpy older people? I don't know. But if you're feeling a little grumpy, right, and you're doing exercise and you're lifting weights because, people like me in the fitness industry is really popularized it, pushed it, which is great. But I feel like we don't talk enough about cardiovascular exercise, and especially when you should kind of shift away from weights to doing cardio, because cardio can really bring you back to baseline much faster. It drops your resting heart rate, it activates even though while you're doing it, it kind of activates your sympathetic system. In other words, your blood pressure is going to increase, your heart rate's going to increase, and stress chemicals get released. But afterwards, you have this rebound effect where those things come down and you feel more relaxed. In fact, many people will report, and this isn't everyone. I think there's some individuality here. So you got to ask people. But in general, what you'll find, or what I've found, is that most of my clients, when I ask them to switch and do more cardiovascular exercise, they feel a lot better afterward. They're like, oh man, I don't know why, but I just feel so good after. As lactate rises during exercise, it's also connected with something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So the more lactate, the more burning in your muscles during exercise, which happens a lot during HIIT training, the more release of this BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, you get. And all of that is to say, like, it makes you better. It makes you feel better cognitively, emotionally. And so I've been talking for a while here, but that's kind of the awareness part, understanding the parts in play, and then understanding which behaviors affect which area of that nervous system, and then looking at your own behavior and saying, like, okay, how do I feel, and how can I optimize this? Because if you're not feeling good, you have a lot of power to change it.
Speaking to is really taking into account each individual and their stress level and what they're going through, because it's easy just to give the same advice across the board to everyone regarding fitness or health, but not everything is going to work for everyone based on what they're going through in their life. And sometimes certain forms of exercise can add to the stress that someone is experiencing, whereas if you choose exercises that help you with the stress, obviously that's going to be a good thing. So people, I want to switch to sort of the high achievers and people of which we've kind of been talking about as far as stress. Sometimes people can say, how do I even find time to fit health into my day, right? And I work with people on trying to really care for themselves and nourish themselves, but they're also health conscious and they want to implement good habits and have the time to take care of themselves. And I talk to people all the time that are out there achieving amazing things in the world, and they feel like their food and their exercise is the thing that's a mess and the thing that's falling apart. So how does someone even kind of find the time, or what are the strategies you use with high achieving people that help them incorporate this into their life?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if you're at the point where you're just like, yeah, I ain't doing exercise. I do not have time to even talk about fitting exercise into my busy schedule. What I would do is start to educate yourself because education can cause a shift. So, for example, with my high achieving clients, I talk to them like, hey, cool, yeah, don't have time to exercise, totally get it. By the way, you saving for retirement or, going to sell your business, you don't want to work forever, do you? I'm like, oh, of course, I have a whole plan and I'm all detailed out. I'm like, cool. Um, Guess what? Exercise is like investing in your retirement plan for your body. Because if you want to be, playing with your grandkids, playing golf, tennis, traveling the world, you have to invest in this. Also, we're all, yeah, I hate kind of saying it this way, but like we all get sick and then we die, right? But that part where our health starts to fall apart, we can really move that a lot, right? We have a lot of power over it. And so the reality is that we're all going to be suffering from those things unless we happen to get into a car accident or something like that. And so you will have to pay one way or another. It's just how, right? Are you going to kind of preemptively take time to exercise and invest and be, just like we would see someone like, hey, I'm not spending too much money now because putting money in retirement. We wouldn't say anything about that person. We give them praise and say, oh man, I wish I was more like you and more on top. And you really think about the future. And the same thing's true with exercise, right? Because our VO2 max goes down with time, which is VO2 max is our cardiovascular fitness. It's a metric, so we can measure it. And it's something that even if you're like a top athlete and you never stop training, it will start to decline when you hit 30. So it's something that we can invest in with cardiovascular exercise because if that gets too low, you get heart failure. And then my dad actually died from heart failure. Part of looking at exercise is some of what you do, Kathryn, like getting away from like, oh, why would I exercise? I don't need to lose weight, right? Or don't want to lose weight. I don't want to deal with the whole weight loss. Well, this isn't about weight loss. In fact, the number one thing that you can do for your health is exercise, even if your weight never changes. Like if it were a pill, it would be $1 trillion medicine and everyone would be lining up to take it. It's just because it isn't, it's cost time to do. Another thing I tell my high achieving clients is like, you are right. There is an opportunity cost to taking time to exercise. And I think a lot of fitness people, they're like, no, come on, you have to exercise. It's so good. Like, yeah, but a lot of people don't like to exercise. And so just being real about it and saying, you're right. You'll have to squeeze in an hour of exercise a few times a week or and when you do that, it's going to take away from other things. Now, the reality is typically what happens is that people become much more efficient, much more happy, much more, just feel a lot better about themselves when they do make the time to exercise. And then they end up, like a lot of my clients end up making more money or, making more sales, having more deals go down simply because they have that glow because they're taking care of themselves, right? And they feel better with their energy. And so, so that's another thing. But again, it is an opportunity cost. People aren't wrong. If you're not, if you're not a fitness person and you're struggling with time, 5 or 10 minutes, it can go a long way. The most important thing is starting with whatever you can start with and being consistent with it. and also like avoiding that negative self-talk, like, oh, this isn't really work, this isn't really doing anything. Yes, it's doing something.
That's really helpful. And I feel like I work with people who are kind of all over the map when it comes to exercise. Like some, like you talked about, maybe aren't doing any and thinking, okay, I can't fit it into my day. And some who are on the very unhealthy spectrum of exercising way too much in the name of like rapid weight loss and kind of abusing their body in that way. That was actually my pattern when I was bulimic, is that I would binge and then I would exercise for like 8 hours the next day to try to
Whoa.
compensate. That was like my form of purging. So when we talk about exercise, it is really finding that healthy balance and not, you talk about all these benefits of it, and all of that is true, and I agree with, and I believe exercise is so important. But there is also a point that it can become a stressor and it can actually work against you. And, I had so many injuries and people I work with when they're abusing exercise. So I think it is finding that middle ground for yourself, that it's fitting into your life and helping you feel healthier and not more drained and more stressed.
Yeah, that's really important too, because I also find, I'll just use myself. I used to exercise quite intensely because I didn't put a lot of emphasis on lower intensity exercise. And so, yeah, you'll end, especially if you're in, like in your case, Kathryn, a big mistake a lot of people make if they're wanting to lose weight, right, is they'll cut the calories and then do a lot of exercise. That's just a recipe for disaster. I actually did that, but unintentionally. I did it because I was following a low carb diet. It's a story for another time, but I was like low carb. It totally like not how I am today. I was totally off in the diet crazy world, but I was under eating carbohydrates and then doing jujitsu. And I hesitate to use the word binge eat, but I would, especially on your show, but I would definitely like gorge on food because I'm like, yeah, I was under eating, and then at a certain point, I was like, how to, screw this, and I'm gonna,
Yeah.
I,
I like the example you gave as far as yourself and getting too restrictive with your food and then overeating. And even though you said it's not for you, it's not in the category of binging, I just think it speaks to the fact that even if someone is not binging or meets that clinical criteria for binge eating, these patterns can still exist of like restrict
mm,
and then overeat. And even people who are quote unquote normal eaters can really relate to this. And I think people who listen to my podcast aren't necessarily all binge eaters. There can be people who are involved in this yo-yo cycle of eating too little and then eating too much and trying to get it under control and then losing control. And even though it's not as extreme as binging, it still feels out of control. And I think that's where it becomes really important when you are out there achieving in the world and you're so busy that you take the time to eat enough, right? You don't just think, oh, I'm so busy, but I need to lose weight, so I'm just not going to eat. Well, that's not going to work because you're going to eat so much more in the long run. So, like, how do you help people incorporate proper nourishment into their day and really make sure they're eating enough in the midst of a really busy life?
yeah, that's a good one. So so there's a couple of things really going for whole foods, right? Which we've all heard and we hear it all the time, but it's true. And more specifically, there's foods that are much more satiating. So, but as far as eating enough, I don't like telling people to skip meals, like intermittent fasting. I'm not a fan of because of the kind of hunger rebound effect that happens that you mentioned. It happens a lot. So a lot of my clients are like, no, I really like to skip breakfast. I'm like, well, that's kind of, you're not where you want to be. And this is what you've been doing for a while. Let's try eating breakfast, even if it's small, and then certainly focusing on protein. Protein is something that we all need. And so I start my clients, depending on their size, of course, with somewhere around 30 to 50 grams of protein in the morning. And that helps with hunger. It helps maintain muscle mass, which, if you are one of those people who's not consistent with exercise, at least getting your protein right can help maintain it. And then finding foods that you like is really helpful. One thing that happens with my clients, I get people because they don't know me that well when they come to work with me. They're like, "Oh, but I don't like eating egg whites." I'm like, "Cool, you don't have to eat them. There's nothing you have to eat. You have to eat protein." And when I say that, because you'll die without eating enough protein. But you can even do, I have never worked with a vegan. It just never works out when we talk. But, and we don't need to get into that. But I'm like, hey, you can have a pea, you can eat seitan I think the way it's pronounced. Um, it's like gluten protein is quite high in protein. There's so many options, right? Protein powder, so many options, Greek yogurt. And so finding foods that you like and focusing on protein first. And then the second thing is getting vegetables, even for breakfast, right? Um, Kind of getting away from the idea that breakfast needs to look or be a certain thing, like eggs, bacon, or the typical what you would consider like the typical American breakfast, like eating vegetables. So having an omelet, for example, with veggies, um, making sure because the fiber, if we're just interested in health, the protein and the nutrients in veggies and the fiber in vegetables as well. Another thing I like having people do is taking psyllium husk. There's a lot of research on psyllium husk and fiber in general, but we're not eating enough of it. And it can help drop cholesterol levels. It can help drop blood sugar levels. And you don't have to, change your diet, right? So if you're not, for example, I'm not the most perfect eater. People think I am. I'm not, right? They look at me and assume that, but I'm not. And sometimes I eat too much sugar or eat too much fat, but it's one thing I do to avoid. And again, it's not something you should do. Like, hey, I'm going to just eat cake 3 times a day and then have psyllium fiber because I heard that's not what I'm telling you to do. I'm just saying you always want to focus on a healthy, nutritious, whole food diet. But like we've talked about this before, Kathryn, you don't want to restrict foods either. And so if you find yourself, in a situation where you end up eating something that, is maybe not the best, yeah, fiber can help. Creatine's another good one as well, as far as supplements are concerned. A lot of research now on creatine in the brain and how, I mean, they're doing research on it. I know we're not really talking about supplements, but it's just an easy win as far as like, again, helping with energy levels because creatine doesn't really help you with muscles directly. It helps you indirectly. And now there's this research on how it's helping people with cognitive decline or even Alzheimer's. So, so yeah, I mean, I could talk about specific nutrients if you want, and like eating 500 grams of cruciferous vegetables for avoiding cancer, and ergothioneine and mushrooms if you want. But I think the basics of what I just said are where people should start. Also, drinking enough water.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's interesting to mention the supplements because a lot of times when people think of health, they think, oh, I just need to cut out things in my life and what can I take away? But sometimes it's about what can I add? Like what can support my body? And whether we're talking about adding vegetables or we're talking about adding a supplement that's right for your body and that, is of course you've talked to your doctor about or whatever, always need to give those disclaimers, but
Sure.
it can be something that just gives you a little boost or supports you or makes you feel like you're doing something good for yourself. And when you make those little tiny habitual shifts and take actions that are meant to support your health, it can motivate you to do more. So even something like drinking water could help motivate you then to take another step to make you feel a little better and then taking another step. You don't have to do it all at once. And I think that's where a lot of high achievers and really anyone who kind of sets on a down a path to on a health journey is like they think they have to do everything. They think they have to exercise for an hour or two every single day. They have to eat all the perfect meals, stay in the perfect calorie range and then when they can't because life is extremely busy, hard, stressful, emotional things happen, they don't make the best choices. And then they think, oh, everything is lost. I'm a failure. I might as well give up. And that pattern also appears in binge eaters, but to a much more extreme way, right? Like I've already failed. I might as well just binge and start over tomorrow. But again, there's some patterns that overlap even in normal eaters. So when you work with high achievers, do you see this perfectionism pattern show up? And how do you help people like release the perfectionism so that they can keep going instead of just giving up when things get hard?
Yeah, it's probably the number one thing that I help people with is that it's
Mhm.
like, let's say you really want to do it and you've tried a lot, but you just haven't been successful at being consistent, right? We're not talking about other people in other situations. Then you have a bit of an issue about how, right? Man, it's the number one thing, like the right time. And it's like, that is such BS. There is no right time. No, 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 there is no. And no, no, look, if you say there's a right time, then there's also a wrong time. And so the wrong time, it kind of means you need perfect conditions to create any type of. If you said, look, it's not the right, look, little Debbie, I know I'm your dad, but it's just not the right time for me to be your parent, for me to be your dad. You would never do that. Or, yeah, it's just not the right time for me to go to work. I've got to do laundry and all these errands. You never do that, but we do it with our health. I mean, people I don't want to get off on a tangent, but people do like not disappear as a parent and people disappear from work. But most of us aren't going to do that. And because we have like this conscientiousness, it's like it would never happen. But with our health, we give up on. And here's a really tough thing. When we're talking about behavior change, we're talking about there's no amount of talk, cognitive reframing or kind of reframing the challenges that you're facing, but ultimately what you'll have to do and what happens in my coaching program is people do run up against obstacles. Doesn't matter the obstacle. Could be different for different people. I had a client who got sick. He was doing really well, got sick, flew to actually Lisbon, Portugal. He had a house there to sell it and then came back. So he had, this goes into our talk about stress. He got sick. Well, guess what? Your sympathetic nervous system gets activated when you're sick, when you got the flu or a cold. And then cross time zones didn't make it worse, even though he flew business class. Still you got to pay the price for crossing time zones for circadian disruption. And so he fell off big time. And then he had a story about like, the I'm a loser story because I fell off. And it's like, no, for me, I mean, if I think someone's kind of messing up, I'll tell them. And in his case, it was like, no, no, no. What I really think happened, yeah, I mean, because sometimes people like, I think you might appreciate this, Kathryn, because sometimes people like, maybe there's a deep psychological reason
Hmm.
why I found, no, you got sick and then you disrupted your circadian rhythms. That's going to mess up anyone. That'll mess me up. I'll have to like, pull myself together afterward. And I have the skills to come back and I have the mindset and also the experience. So the point being, like, as you go through the challenges and when you want to quit, that's actually the time that you need to figure out how to be consistent. So many people say, you know what, if I wasn't working with you, I would have given up. And because of they are working with me, they don't give up and we work through it and we come out the other side and we're still able to make progress. And unfortunately, we all have to go through the challenge of doing that, whether it's an injury that sets us back, whether it's vacation or work stress. We'll all have to work through those challenges to be consistent. And yeah, so that's kind of those are some ideas and some stories about how we deal with that.
Yeah. And I think those stories you told get back to the beginning when we talked about stress and
Yeah.
what that kind of does to our brain. And Like you talked about, the person wasn't a loser because they fell into some old patterns when they got stressed. It's just the brain's conditioning, right? It doesn't mean they're deeply broken psychologically. It means their brain is trying to protect them in a certain way. And like I talked about, binge eaters can get in this pattern too, where stress causes these urges. And if you're not aware of this, it can be so easy to fall down that path. But once you develop that awareness and once you know that, okay, in times of stress or in relation to many different triggers in my life, I could have these urges to perform certain behaviors that are not helpful, but I don't have to keep following those habitual patterns. And when you are able to redirect, when you're able to make different choices in times of stress, you see, kind of like you did and you, when telling your own story, that that actually helps you cope with stress better in the long term, right? Following those habitual unhelpful patterns in times of stress, it's actually really hurting you. But when you see, like, oh, my brain wants me to do this thing that doesn't really help, but I'm actually going to do this thing that my rational mind knows actually helps me, it really can change everything.
Yeah, 100%. And people feel so good when they come out the other side
Yeah.
and feel like, oh wow, I changed my behavior because it feels like you're progressing, you're making progress, not even with your health goals, but like a personal and psychological level.
Hmm.
And one thing I would add, there's going back to the brain stuff, there's a distinction I really like. Sometimes it's called system one, system two, but I prefer the hot and cold cognition. So, yeah, if people don't understand, I think a lot of high achievers too, sometimes the ego gets in the way. They feel like, oh, I'm super powerful. I'm directing all my behavior, but it's never true, right? We're always, if that's the case, why would you ever have to drag yourself out of bed? Who's doing the dragging? Who are you dragging if it's you, right? Why do you have to hold your tongue, right? Why don't you just not want to say the wrong thing, right? But we experience the human experience, and to your point, our brain it's wired in a way where you kind of have this experience of two parts to ourselves, and there's this hot cognition, cold cognition, and an easy way to the way I like to explain this is when you first started learning how to drive a car, because it's socially not really acceptable in most places in the US, you need to learn how to drive the car or drive a car, especially most places aren't walkable. So you need to learn how to drive. And when you first drive, I don't know about you, Kathryn, but I was freaked out. I was like, look in the mirror, look in the rear mirror, don't hit anybody. Oh my gosh, it was so stressful. And that's an example of cold cognition where I'm having to think about everything. Okay, foot on the brake. Is it on the brake or is it on the okay, let's shift gears and let's like it's super stressful and it takes a lot of mental energy. It would be so much easier just to say, you know what, I'm not going to do this, right? And so, but we don't give up on that because again, socially we need to learn how to drive a car. It's really important. And most of us can get to the point where we're like driving in our car, and then we're talking on the phone and we end up home and we don't even know how we got there.
Yeah.
You just end up there and you're like still talking, oh, I just got home, I gotta go, right?
Mhm.
And and that's an example of when you were learning, that was you were using cold cognition to train your brain to learn the things that you need to pay attention to, how to move the steering wheel, shift gears, and look around. And now you do it, and you're like, you're
Yeah.
talking to your best friend, and it's not a problem. So now driving is hot cognition. And unfortunately, with some of the wiring in our brain, I love what you talk about because some of us we're not suffering from deeply rooted trauma. We're just suffering from kind of having being human beings, right? And
Hmm.
the wiring of our brain. Our brain, it's like it's going to want to eat more for a lot of people. Not everybody gets stress eating, but some people don't eat when they're stressed, and depends on the person, type of stress, right? But for a lot of people, probably the majority of people, stress tends to make them eat more. And so that's kind of going from I'm being healthy takes kind of you have to be trained, right? You have to train yourself. And some of us get it growing up from our parents, but most of us, I mean, my parents weren't very healthy. Both of my parents were attorneys, high functioning alcoholics, and they were super smart, they were successful, but yeah, I didn't learn health habits, even though my dad kind of got me started in exercise. He did have a stint there where he was lifting, but most of us, we don't learn this stuff. So if you weren't taught it also, it's not your fault that you weren't taught this stuff. It's not taught well in schools. Most of our parents didn't need it even. They were just more healthy in the past. So so a lot of things have changed, right? Seated workplaces and so on. And so anyway, yeah, it takes time. And any time where you're using that cold cognition to learn anything, could be learning the guitar, learning, learning moves, trying to establish a habit of going to the gym, learning exercises, it becomes really easy to give up on when stress levels get high enough, right? That's what causes the default, the triggering back to old habits. Just like, if you're like, I'm not going to yell anymore in my relationship, and then you just get to like you had a long day, and then and you find yourself like, oh, I'm sorry, I knew I wasn't going to do that, but
Hmm.
right? Stress makes us lose control is another way of saying it.
Yeah. Yeah, and the more aware you are, the more you can not go down that familiar pathway. And like you were talking about, it just gets easier over time. With the driving example is such a powerful example because that's one that's not super emotionally charged for a lot of us. So it's easy to see how that habitual like habit change happens. And the same thing happens with binging. I tell people all the time that yeah, at first it's going to take some effort to recognize the thoughts and the feelings that led you down that pathway, but eventually you just hear those thoughts and you just don't even care anymore. Like they just sound like completely not you, and it gets so easy and then it just goes away. Just like driving, you eventually just get home without even kind of realizing how you got home. So that's what's so powerful about building these habits is that you eventually just do them without even thinking. They become part of who you are. And, as I always remind people on this show, is it's not about doing them in any sort of extreme way, right? Like after you stop binging, I always tell people like that's your first priority to stop the binging. Obviously, nourish yourself really well, but people do want to be able to focus on health and be able to focus on health in a way that doesn't send them back down an unhealthy path. Like a lot of people that do listen to the show have come from a place where they took health down a very dark path to obsession and not eating enough and starving themselves. And yeah, like that's not the path of health, being too
For sure.
extreme with it. So it's finding that middle path. And like maybe the driving example comes in there too, is like steering yourself on that middle way, not going too far to the extreme restriction and not going too far to the overindulgence and keeping yourself on that middle path of balance.
Yeah, that's really well said. I like the Buddhist reference there. I spent some time in Thailand and which is a Buddhist culture, and yeah, it's like the extremes are just in really anything. I mean, I guess some people make an argument like for people who are really trying to create something, like I hesitate to mention his name, but Elon Musk, a guy like that, right? Because I know he's a bit of a like I don't care about him really, but
Yeah.
but he's trying to get us to Mars, right? And unless you're doing something like that that requires extreme sacrifice, yeah, um, most of us are going to fall into that like, hey, let's have a healthy, balanced life. And another way of looking at health that I wanted to share is there's a great model called the biopsychosocial model because some people, and maybe some of the people you work with, I don't work with people with eating disorders. I don't have the knowledge, experience, skills to to help those people. But people who are trying to achieve or overemphasizing exercise and diet probably are missing out. So the biopsychosocial, let me say this before I go on there. There's the biology side of health, there's the psychology side of health, and then there's the social side of health. So it brings up this thing like, what is really a great question, like, what is really healthy? So if I run marathons, there's no argument about whether I'm biologically fit or not, right? I'm fit. I'm fit. But what if I'm suffering from depression and I don't have friends because I don't have social skills and or I'm a recluse, right? And is that person healthy? Or is a person who is 70 years old and they have terminal cancer, so biologically not in a good place, but they're looking at their life saying, you know what? I've lived a great life. I had this great family. Maybe they're religious too. There's a lot of interesting, I'm not a particularly religious person, but I'm aware of and appreciative of the research on religion and how it helps people. And so, like, is that person healthy? Right? And so it brings up this thing, but certainly health is more than just your weight, it's more than just exercise. And probably the biggest thing, I was one of those people who was quite fit. I didn't wasn't running marathons, wasn't my thing, but I was lean, I was muscular, I certainly had good cardiovascular endurance, but I was struggling a lot after my brother was murdered. And no, unfortunately, there's wasn't like I could go listen to a podcast about it and talk about like here's what's going on with stress hormones in your brain and PTSD, et cetera. And so I was like I felt horrible all the time. And I I thought I was being, at the time I thought I was being poisoned, like so many people believe now. I think there's still a little bit of an argument, but it's not like what people say. Some people feel like, oh, they're so toxic. It's like, you're probably struggling with an anxiety disorder, right? Or maybe in my case, like PTSD from something or but because the removing of the red dye is not, anyway. But
Yeah.
looking at those other aspects of health because they're underappreciated. And so if you're in a relationship that's toxic, oh, I had I won't name names or say it too much, but I worked with a woman and she was having some trouble in my program. And I was like, well, what's going on? Is everything okay at work? And she said something about her boss was being a pain. But then after I dug a little bit more, she said she had a stalker. And I was like, oh my God, there's a way out of my experience and skill. Like, I'm
Yeah.
like, hey, listen, I'm not really equipped to deal with this, but like, hey, let's look together at what you can do. Here's a hotline you can call. And so that's an example of something where if that's an extreme example, but if you're dealing with something like that, there's no amount of exercise or meditation even that's going to fix it. You're going to have to deal with the deeper issues, or if in a less extreme way, if you don't like the work you're doing because you're doing it to make money, but you feel like it's maybe out of alignment with who you are, that affects your health, the relationships. So it's really important to look at health in a more holistic way because that's kind of what we're learning is some of the most important parts. Even if you're having like unexplainable health issues and you can track it, like me at the time in my 20s, it wasn't I was being poisoned by, the toxic environment because there's even more. I feel great today, and there's even more chemicals than
Yes.
20 years ago, right? And so it's like looking at those things and making sure we're taking inventory of not just exercise and supplements and nutrition, but also the social side and psychological side of health.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's really important for people to look at because it's so easy to think, oh, I just need to restrict something else from my diet or take away something else or exercise more or push harder. And that they're ignoring all these other factors of health that can really affect you much more than the food. And people who tend to get obsessed with food and obsessed with weight, the more they focus on that, the more unhealthy they can be. So switching the focus to the other factors that relate to health in other realms is really kind of some of the most powerful health shifts that they can make.
Yeah, I had to give a story of another person. I had a client and he was just crushing it and just doing everything. And he was like, well, okay, well, what else can I do? I'm like, there's nothing else you can do. You're doing everything. You just got to keep doing it. And also, you don't want to spend more time. Like he was a new dad. He was one of the younger people I've worked with, early 30s, but a super high achiever, doing really well. And then we started having conversations about like what other things in life need to happen. And for him, it was that he was working in another business and really wanted to do something on his own. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, then that's where you want to focus, right? Don't spend more time in the gym. Otherwise, it starts to become like you. I think people, again, don't talk about this enough. You can start coping with the stress in your life in a super negative way, doing drugs, alcohol, right, binge eating, etc. But you can also do the healthy things, like that's what I did. You can start escaping from what you know you need to face in your life by exercise. And it's not making, to your point, it doesn't make you healthier, right? Because you have to recover from exercise. It becomes another stress, especially if it's too much volume or too much intensity, and it will break you down. So yeah, so making sure that, want to be healthy, got to look at those other aspects.
Yeah, and the things with exercise and food is recognizing where the line is between it being a healthy habit and then an unhealthy compulsion, and kind of seeing where those lines are for you, and when is your exercise and your eating, when is it a healthy habit and when is it an unhealthy compulsion, and really trying to stop using it in ways that are unhealthy and that feel compulsive.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ted, for having this conversation. I thought it was really insightful and powerful, and I appreciate you being here today.
Thanks, Kathryn. It was a lot of fun as well.
I hope you found this conversation valuable and found inspiration in Ted's personal story and the work he does with others. I've included a link to Ted's website and podcast in the show description if you want to learn more. And as always, you can find links to the Brain Over Binge resources in the show description as well, including my books, my online course that is only $18.99 per month, as well as one-on-one coaching and group coaching. Thank you so much for listening to the Brain Over Binge podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast through the platform of your choice so that you don't miss any future episodes. Until next time, I want to encourage you and remind you that you have the power to change your brain and live a binge-free life. The Brain Over Binge podcast is produced and recorded by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC. All work is copyrighted by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC, and all rights are reserved. As a disclaimer, the hosts of the Brain Over Binge podcast are not professional counselors or licensed healthcare providers, and this podcast is not a substitute for medical advice or any form of professional therapy. Eating disorders can have serious health consequences, and you are strongly advised to seek medical attention for matters relating to your health. Please get help when you need it, and good luck on your journey.